Right, very good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me? I hope I'm audible to all. Right, perfect. I see a little thumbs and thumbs coming up. That's wonderful. Welcome to all of you to this. It's our sixth dialogue at Future Africa. And it's really a pleasure today because I think the topic is very provocative. We're speaking about the pleasure of transgressing borders through the poetics of space and time. And I must say, when I posed this challenge to the two presenters, they took it up with enthusiasm. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And just as a little bit of a background about the topic itself, the idea comes from this the acknowledgement that when we do transdisciplinary based research, we are grappling with the challenge of acknowledging the use of several forms and stages of knowledge. They call it polymorphous, during a process of research that embraces the diversity of many simultaneous points of view. Polyphony, it's a fancy name. To engage in an open and collective way of doing research, we often inadvertently have to consider the role of paradigms, evolving paradigm shifts, doctrines like existentialism, etc., that is and was dominant in and at certain periods of or situations. This comprehensive challenge seldom entertains the possibility of allowing the necessary space for the imagination, also referred to as poetics, that will allow us to plan for an uncertain future. So there's lots of meat in this idea, and I think the work that the presentation that we're going to hear from Lesley, who's our main speaker, and then Prof Mano's reaction to her presentation is going to be very provocative and interesting. So just to introduce our main speakers, first of all, we have Professor Lesley Green. I think most of us remember and know her from her award-winning book that she wrote on rock, water, and life, and the absolutely amazing way that she could bring together so many factors in one space to tackle one project or one idea or one problem. And the way that I personally found it very interesting how she used metaphors to actually transgress some of the problems that she was speaking about. Professor Lesley Green, I think you all know, not just from her book, but also from her work that she's been doing. She's a professor in earth politics at the University of Cape Town and leads the Critical Zone Africa project. Critical zone is a term that comes from Bruno Latour. We all, I'm sure, are familiar with that idea. And she specializes in transdisciplinary curriculum development and justice-based environmental governance in South Africa. And then to react to her presentation, we have Professor Manu Ramutsindela at the he is the UPUCT Future Africa Research Chair in Sustainability Transformation and a professor of human geography at the University of Cape Town. His research explores socio-ecological relations and the political ecology of, specifically in this case, the peace parks. So both of them are really sort of touching on the same thing, and it's a pleasure to introduce the two speakers and invite them to share their ideas on this topic that we've presented to them. So over to you, Prof. Green.
Hi, hello, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you, Dr. Du Plessis, and lovely to see you, Prof. Mano. I know you're there behind your title there on the screen. So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be in dialogue with Future Africa, and I do want to say that I have long admired Future Africa and what it's doing, what the vision is behind it. I think it's a really inspiring project. And it's wonderful to see such a bold statement about the future of the possibilities of Pan-African scholarship. So thank you both, Dr. Du Plessis and Prof. Mano, for the leadership that you bring to this. and I look forward to the conversation. So yeah, so let me share my, I've got a couple of things to share here, and that's that, and then we go to that. Right, are we in business? Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can see.
Yeah, good, right. So I pulled out a couple of paragraphs or sentences from the brief of the conversation that Dr. du Plessis and Prof Mano wanted to have, and some of those, could imagination, imagery, and metaphors be considered as a major power of human nature? What a wonderful thought. How did the transgression of borders through poetics enable us to face a sustainable future that we cannot predict? How do we move beyond popular and economic organizational concerns? Is another one. The role of paradigms, evolving paradigm shifts, and doctrines. And then a lovely comment about my book, which I'm grateful for, that the book traverses and transgresses the dominant binary positions often found in the sciences and humanities. And, that's very much what the book sought to do, to traverse and transgress. So, just I wanted to say that that's where we start, and that's where this conversation began in this kind of thought piece that Dr. du Plessis sent me. And so I've given it this title, Poetics in Sustainability Sciences. But before I even begin, I want to acknowledge some others, not just because of the ethics of acknowledging others, but because there's some really rich dialogues and context that that shape how I think, and that where there's conversations going on that are useful to follow up. The first is, I'm not sure how many of you are aware that 2024 to 2033 is the UN's International Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development. And that's really interesting because the SDGs have the target date of 2030. We clearly are not going to meet that target date. And there's some very, very interesting things happening in the review of what the Sustainable Development Goals have achieved. And if you look at the SDG reporting website online, you'll see that many countries report significant progress in the social goals, but not so much in the environmental goals. And that in itself is well and good. However, if you look a little closer, very often you see that the social goals are being met at the expense of environmental goals. So there, even in the SDGs, you have a kind of split between society and ecology. And that suggests to me that there's a problem in the way that we're thinking about it. And that's where the environmental humanities comes in. And I want to acknowledge and thank all my colleagues and graduate students, many of whom are now colleagues, in Environmental Humanities South, where I've had the privilege to work for the last decade at UCT, to think through what does, how do we understand nature? How does this conceptualization of science come to us? And what does it mean to engage with environmental sciences from the Global South? I want to note that we are funded by the Science for Africa Foundation based in Nairobi, and that is an extraordinary foundation to which I'm deeply grateful, not just for the money, which of course one is grateful for, but because it's driven by a group of people who are profoundly invested in African scholarship that answers African questions. And that work feeds into the work that I was doing, particularly last year. I've pulled back a little bit due to work pressures from the Earth Humanity Coalition. But that Earth Humanity Coalition was put forward by the International Year of Basic Sciences team, which was extremely successful, again, a UN year, which comes from the world of physics, indeed from CERN, in other words, the dialogue from physics and astronomy, the hard sciences, with the question of how do we go on protecting our planet, and in recognition that our environmental sciences have not yet reached the goals that we're setting for them. So what I'm setting out here is that the way we are approaching sustainability comes to us with a history. And if we start to think through that history, we can start to see things a little bit differently. And most important, if we can start to find different ways to put our words together, perhaps we'll come up with different kinds of solutions. So I want us to kick off with a couple of key thinkers who have put so much into this. Arundhati Roy would not be a stranger to most of you. An extraordinary thinker, essayist, novelist from India. And her book of essays, The End of Imagination, is a rich, rich, rich read. What she speaks to is the problem of the closing down of imagination post-1990. If you think through the 80s into the early 1990s, there was this effervescence of global struggle for human rights, for post-colonial contexts, for liberation struggles. And there was a flowering of thinking and imagining different kinds of futures. Around about 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall, closely followed by the release of Mandela from prison, and so many other changes, leads to this triumphalism of the West over the putative East, to capitalism versus socialism. Francis Fukuyama writes the book The End of History as the end of historical struggle. And this book of Arundhati Roy's essays is absolutely extraordinary in that she describes the ways in which neoliberal thought, the neoliberal consensus, the triumphalism of capital as if this is the end of history and the end of historical struggle, sees us acquiescing to a new era of economic and financialized thinking, of technocracy, of technocratic bureaucracy, if you want to put all of that together. And what she diagnoses here is the inability to think outside of the frameworks given to us by technobureaucracy, this conversion of finance and ideology into a matrix of tick boxes. Another thinker that is extraordinary, and so the critique of technobureaucracy, one set of issues. Isabel Stenger's distinguished philosopher of science, professor at the Free University in Brussels, who co-wrote with Ilya Prigozhin the masterful work on chaos theory, which was fed into, some of that work fed into the work that for which Prigozhin was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And Isabel Stengers has really grappled with what does it mean to do science in the current era, and this 2-volume set, Cosmopolitics 1 and Cosmopolitics 2, has 7 books within it. You can see the titles of those on the screen. And she starts with the problem of the science wars and the ways in which we have landed in a space of polemic for science against science. And of course, at the moment, we see that playing out intensively in the USA in particular. And the reliance that we have on Newtonian mechanics as a way of thinking in kind of boxes and arrows. There's a lot more to be, a huge amount to be said about these 2 volumes. That's really an extraordinary set of works. But there's 2 ideas that I want to leave you with in talking about cosmopolitics. Isabel Stengers gives us a way to think through the integration of two dualisms that are central to the way we do science and, by implication, the way we do environmentalism. The first binary that she works with is the nature-society divide. That really has no business being there. The Anthropocene climate change teaches us empirically, day by day, that humans and planet are not separate, that all our being, all our doing together every day is destroying the habitability of our planet. We are planetary beings. We have planetary effects. Why then do we persist in teaching science and social science separately? On my campus, with its beautiful design, we have sciences on one side of campus, we have social sciences and arts on the other side of campus, with maths and the arts facing one another around the great big Greek temple in the middle. But Stengers and others give us a way to address the history of that idea as a cosmology that we inherited from the 1600s in Europe. That cosmology has everything to do with the struggle over Galileo's work, where Galileo was pressed to deny his scientific findings in order to stay alive. So this history of the split between the church and the sciences, goes back even to as far as the 1400s, and it coalesces and consolidates in the 1600s and 1700s with the birth of science as a political diplomacy between the church and the sciences. We will just observe with our eyes, say the scientists. Let us keep our heads on our shoulders. Don't execute us and excommunicate us. We are doing God's work. We are observing what God has done with our eyes, with our science, our empirical work. So we will work empirically with the science. We will leave matters of theology and spirit, which becomes matters of culture, to you, the church. And so this peace treaty that allows people like René Descartes to do his work, although even he ended his life in exile as a heretic. The struggle to keep science alive has a very, very particular history. That is a cosmological history. We have received that inheritance of the way science is done, and we're still playing it out. It's a little bit like the old joke about the child who goes to the mother and says, "But mother, when you cook the roast leg of lamb, why do you always cut the side off at first and put it in the pot next to it?" And the mother says, "Well, actually, I don't know. My mother did that." And so they go to Granny and they say, "Granny, why did you always cut the side of the roast off before you cook the roast?" And she laughed and she said, "Oh, that's because my oven was too small." So we inherit these things that are pragmatic solutions as tradition. And if we continue to play those out without thought of why, whether we still need those traditions. The other key thing of cosmopolitics, the political cosmology, the consensus of rationality and the normal that Isabel enables us to think with, is the split between object and subject. That as a scientist, I must split myself into the objects that I study, and my subjective self is kept aside. So we'll split subject and object. And she makes a very strong case throughout this cosmopolitics. She's arguing that mind and world are part of the same thing. That when a mathematician is seeing the sunset and watching the colors change, that mathematician's mind is part of the world as much as the colors are part of the world. That we shouldn't be separating first order and second order reality in the way that we do. So in other words, this is an extraordinary work that gives us a route to thinking differently. Crucially for us here in the Global South, that work ends with volume 7, The Curse of Tolerance, where she engages questions of indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, and asks and poses this very tough question of how do we incorporate those into our universities, into our teaching, into our sciences. And she calls that book The Curse of Tolerance, because she says, who wants to just be tolerated? You know, just offering some kind of what one Indian scholar whose name I forget once called epistemic charity. You know, if we're just giving out epistemic charity and charitably allowing a little bit of ethno this and ethno that into our universities, we're not actually opening up. You know, we're just simply tolerating. And tolerance, ultimately, in the work of scholarship, to be tolerated is just a curse, because you're never actually fully integrated. But this work that she's doing on nature, society, subject, object, provides the basis for being able to think differently. So, to continue, curiously, one of the most important sites where that very discussion was had most productively was in the 1950s among Black European scholars, Black scholars mainly from Paris, but this became a global movement. And this was the first great meeting of writers and artists, écrivains and artistes. I don't speak French, forgive my pronunciation, but it's présence, African presence. And they're asking the crucial question, what does it mean to be present in the world as a subject when you have always been the object? The image that they used for this was actually drawn by Picasso, who was a great ally of this movement, and a great friend of Aimé Césaire. He actually illustrated one of Aimé Césaire's books of poetry, which was called Lost Body. And this was the cover image, which is a portrait of Césaire. There's a lot of history and a lot of visual references in that image, which I will leave out for now in the interests of time. But the key thing that this movement was addressing was, how do you speak back and reclaim your presence in the world when you have been objectified? The term that Aimé Césaire uses in his book Discourse on Colonialism is thingification. You know, this rendering of a person or a tree or a bird as a thing in and of itself, separate from its relations. You know, like all those many books of taxonomies of species, where you just see the picture of the bird on a white page with nothing around it, no tree, no nest, no fellow birds. There's just this image. This is kind of thingification. And of course, that was rich and rife in ethnology of the time. Césaire's career, crucially, begins when he arrives in Paris, fresh out of high school, having won the prize for the top student in Martinique in the Caribbean, wins a prize to go and study in Paris, and arrives in the early 1930s at the same time as the French colonial exhibition has just kicked off. And, you know, this exhibition, which took up many hectares, in fact, a couple of hundred hectares in Paris, with exhibitions of Africans, of Filipinos, of Arabs, and their arts. You know, the French colonial world is on display, including children in zoos. And Césaire is horrified, as was Léopold Senghor, who becomes his great friend, and the two of them together develop the philosophy of negritude, pushing back against the rationality of the sciences at the time, which objectified Black life. And I think the crucial thing for us here is to recognize that there's a dual track between philosophy of the sciences that is taking us into reunifying subject and object, nature and society, and the work that was being done many decades before, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, by African scholars who are from a different direction addressing the problem of the same binaries, the same conceptual structure. And I think for Césaire, what was so striking was the impossibility of speaking to science, to the very people whom he had gone for his higher education. The reigning philosophy of the colonial at the time made it impossible for him to think. So how was he supposed to think, to learn from people whose version of the world presented a knowledge about his society in which he could not recognize anyone that he knew, least of all himself? How can I learn from you if your version of me has got nothing to do with me? So Césaire's work is key. And I think this is a really important convergence between contemporary philosophy of science in the 2000s and the work that was being done more than 50 years ago by African scholars, because I think it's important to recognize that many of the struggles that we have in our dialogues with and around what science is have got a very deep history in the anti-colonial struggle. Here's a picture of Césaire. One of Césaire's essays is an essay called Poetry and Knowledge. It's published, you can find a copy of it in this book, The Refusal of the Shadow. And there on the left, you see the cover of his book, Lost Body, which speaks to the theme of absence, of being the object, being unable to be present in one's own body. And I think, again, that kind of work helps us to excavate and make sense of the ontological, conceptual, philosophical inheritances that we have with these binaries and bifurcations that are not helpful to the practice of thought. And this essay is an absolutely magnificent essay. It's fairly short, it's about 7 pages. Poetic knowledge is born in the great silence of scientific knowledge. Science affords a view of the world, but a summary and superficial one. The natural sciences classify. In short, scientific knowledge enumerates, measures, classifies, and kills, he says. It is necessary to add that scientific knowledge is poor and half-starved. Now, this might sound to some as an affront. I hope that that's not the case. I am a great respecter of any and all versions of knowledge. We'll come back to that in a moment. But you can have a sense here of the rage of someone who has experienced being, if you look a couple of lines from the bottom, the depersonalized and de-individualized self. So this is somebody who's pushing back against the kind of science that was dominant in the 1930s. Now, we've all come a very long way since then. So this is not a comment on all science, and it's not a comment on, on every way of knowing coming from the sciences. It's a particular context. So I really hope that nobody's offended by this text, but I think it's crucial to understand this text as a text that is posing hugely important questions about the kind of science that made it possible to name as knowledge the depersonalized, de-individualized, objectified self. And a couple of words that I want to come back to towards the bottom of the second page. It talks about trembling and wonderment, strangeness and intimacy, attraction and terror, the sacred. And these are the kinds of, those are what he sees in the great silence of scientific knowledge. So he's calling for the kind of science to shift. Now, a lot of work has been done since then towards different forms and different articulations of science. But this is what the decolonial, anti-colonial movement was calling for, a different kind of science that recognizes humanity and presence. So that is not far away from the kind of knowledges that are known across the continent. You know, sons and daughters of soil as a phrase which you find across the continent as an honorific, teach us that soil health is health of bodies, of health of households. Wangari spoke about soil, the skin of the earth. I learned recently a wonderful Oromo saying in Ethiopia, my land, my bones. And this was a cry, and this was used as a cry in the streets when the central Addis Ababa was being cleared for the new developments. There was this uprising, like, my land, my bones, my land, my bones. You know, thousands of people in the street chanting this. You know, and there's so many examples of an African environmentalism that understands the relationship between body and environment in a totally different cosmology than the dualisms that we've inherited. So how do we think? For Césaire, the only way to think outside of the strictures of science is to use the poetic form and the dramatic form, which of course he was a great exponent of. This picture of the chair you'll find in my book, but it's sitting here in my office. And I love this image because it's, you know, man and woman holding a gourd together that is giving life. And it speaks to earth and relationality, the craft of knowledge as a craft of relationality. And there's this beautiful sense of the bird and the fish being in some kind of world-making relation as well. And so the work that Césaire and fellow anti-colonial scholars in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s were doing was reclaiming relationality. And it's very interesting to see that kind of relationality emerging now across the global south and elsewhere, some parts of the global north, as well as the movement for constitutional change to give rights to rivers, to give rights to certain kinds of species, which is not that mad if you consider that Woolworths, Pick and Pay, BP, you know, companies have had for long the right to legal status as a person, as personhood. So it's not that far-fetched to start to say, well, perhaps a river can have the rights of legal personhood, perhaps a tree, or perhaps a glacier, you know. So there's this move globally from indigenous movements to think about relationality as an alternative way of bringing things together. And it's very interesting that, too, if you look back at the Caribbean work in particular, and Afrofuturism, this push into poetics, precisely because poetics allows you to make connections that you can't see in the prevailing rationalities. And again, this pops up in contemporary European philosophy of Anthropocene and environment. Andreas Weber is a German ecologist, and this book, Enlivenment, is a small, thin, and magnificent text towards a poetics for the Anthropocene. Why poetics? Because you can make connections that are a prevailing version of rationality, which is part of the problem we've inherited, is unable to address. And again, he speaks of enlivenment as the capacity to mix, not to mix, but to no longer separate the emotive self from the scholarly self. And that's interesting too, when you see so many climate scientists in huge distress and actually allowing their distress to speak. You know, there's a very interesting moment now, historically, where emotion and science are no longer that separate either. Just to think, you know, this, I love these. These are piano notes. These are the shapes that different notes make: A, D, B, F, C, G. Those are the notes that different frequencies make. You press a piano note, like, you know, an E, and if you had sand on a drum, you would see it filtering into particular kinds of shapes. Or if you have water and you can photograph the play of that frequency through water, you'll see different shapes. The different notes have got different shapes. This magnificent insight, beautiful. Who would have thought that notes have got shapes, and such beautiful shapes too? There's a magic and a mystery here, which is the wonder of process. What you're seeing in those images is the unfolding of relations in space and time, the unfolding of an audio frequency with its vibrations in time. I mean, each of these would be microseconds as the note peaks and then falls off. So you can find on YouTube some of these images and seeing how they peak and fall off. But I think what's so magnificent about this is it reminds us that everything is an event in a process. My glass of water right here is an event in a process. It's 2/3 full right now. It'll be empty soon. You know, everything is in the process. So one of the ways in which we can start to open up a different poetics, in the sense of different kind of rhetoric of sustainability science, is to be open to process, the unfolding of interactions and relations in space and time, that everything is unfolding. And again, the magnificence of Ben Okri's reflections on story, teaching us that everything is a story. And this kind of orientation to science teaches us that every action leaves a trace, every action is part of a transformation. You know, beach sand used to be little, you know, billions and gazillions of little creatures. And it's come to us, it's not, beach sand is not purely geology, it's biology, you know. And it's even as we see beach sand, it itself is transforming, you know. So now this is a process orientation to the unfolding of relations, rather than reducing everything to an object set in a Cartesian matrix XY axis of space and a particular, you know, Gregorian calendar moment of time. You know, instead of having a fixed object, these are unfolding. Now, let's come to sustainability science. I went through a couple of review articles of sustainability science, and I noticed something interesting, is a number of them have been presenting word clouds. And so this was one word cloud from a review of sustainability articles in journals. What were the dominant words? You know, you can create these word clouds. You know, here's another one: stakeholders, decision-making, awareness, consensus. All of you would be so familiar with these kinds of words. You go to a conference and it's like your head is full of these words. Here's another one. This comes from our colleagues in Stellenbosch. These are the dominant words that they found in the sustainability sciences. But what do these words mean? I sat in a conference in Addis Ababa last year sometime, listening for 3 days to people talking about sustainability, and these were the words I was hearing. But what bothered me was that I couldn't distinguish between the putative oil company executives using these words with their particular set of meanings and claims on these meanings, and activists. And it was clearly we're not talking about the same thing, and yet we're using the same words. And I think this is where poetics can be so useful. I'm going to try and be... Yes.
Prof Green, can I
Yes.
ask Mano to maybe, as you move into this sustainability section of your presentation, if he can just quickly reflect for us, or maybe ask you something about the first section where you
Sure.
really so evocatively, you know, trace the whole, what we could call the landscape to
Yes.
get to this point of sustainability. Prof.
Yes.
Mano, will you be able to just make a few comments here? Have a bit of a conversation, and then
yes, that's thank you very much. Thanks, Lesley, for taking us through the the history of the divide between society and the social sciences and other sciences. But I couldn't help but think about how that history has permeated to our thinking up to today, how that history has been maintained in its various forms to influence the way we think about the society and nature, what the boundaries that have been created under a very different historical moment have been maintained, and I would even argue they have been strengthened over time, irrespective of the recognition that the world is going through difficulties in ensuring that society is sustainable. People have food to eat. They have got a place, a roof over their head, that they are looked after in terms of health. And what I find very disturbing in that divide is the kind of violence that has emerged. So people who are still living in a way that we imagine the future should look like, where people and nature coexist. But people who are living in the forests, for example, are seen as the enemies of the forests. And this is not only a practice. In my view, we have got international instruments that are also developed along those lines. The conventions, you mentioned the goals that we have set for the SDGs, where some of the things are going towards society, but not the environment. So we have maintained that boundary. At the international level, the instruments that have emerged, if we look at the behaviors of the donors themselves, they're financing this boundary. So there is a way in which this boundary benefits certain groups of sectors of society, groups of people, certain classes in society. And that becomes very difficult to dismantle. And if we were to think about sustainability in a serious way, we need to call on those actors who are maintaining the boundary to understand the harm that they're doing to both society and nature. And I think that's a difficult decision to take, but we have to make it clear why we are where we are. We don't want to say we are all in this. When there are floods, when the temperatures are rising, without saying who is doing the wrong thing. And Africa is seen as a place where we can test ideas, of people living with nature, and some of these have got an element of racism to them, in the sense that you can live with the elephants here, but not in the UK, not in Germany. I mean, and so it's quite important for us to reclaim the humanity, not only in a particular place, but the humanity of us, of everyone, everywhere, so that if indeed we are serious about sustainability, which is the point you wanted to go to, we should deal with this boundary, and specifically how it has been financed. That's one point I want to really make, because it resonates with some of the points you've made, but also with what I've been worried about for some time. The other, a point that I would just highlight is the frameworks that we're using, and you refer to this. And thanks for sharing some of the histories and summarizing the books that speak to this framework. How do we undo the frameworks in order for us to develop new concepts that would anchor the kind of frameworks that would speak to our concerns and will push for a sustainability that is just, that is also anchored on the equality of people. So the frameworks, and we're talking about sustainability here, and there has been sustainable development, and who knows, there will be something else later on. And these concepts themselves constrain the way we think about the world, the way we think about where we are in the world, the way we ask questions about the world, and about life in general. So perhaps it is important for us to think of new concepts that we could then use to develop the frameworks that we think will serve our purpose. So I'll pause there. I just realized that now we've run out of time, but I thought I'll just share those few points. Thank you, Hester. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. Manu. That was very valuable. But I am very excited to hear the rest of your presentation, Lesley. So please continue. We don't have much time, but I am really keen to hear what you say further. Thank you so much.
Let me just share. Oh, no, hang on, I'm going back to the wrong thing here. Sorry. Yeah. Share, here we go. So let me just pop in here, and let me make that one screen. This was Karma and Krumah, and I think this really speaks, Manu, to what you're saying. And this was a speech he gave at the launch of, I think it was the African Academy of Sciences in Ghana in 1965, which was the very first Academy of Sciences on the continent. And unless science is used for the betterment of mankind, particular product of history, that word, I am at a loss to understand the reason for it all. It doesn't require a clever brain to destroy life. In fact, any fool can do that. But it takes brains, and extraordinarily brilliant brains, to create conditions for human happiness and to make life worth living. And again, this comes up in a moment where Africa, and this was the first president of the first independent country in Africa, in that century. And I think this is so brilliant. And this Manu takes me back to a couple of years ago. I read something that for me was really formative. It's a small website. The Zapatista movement in Mexico convened a meeting with scientists from across Mexico, a couple of days. And they brought their scientists into dialogue with the captains and commanders of the movement. And in the records of that meeting, what the Zapatista movement says to the scientists of Mexico is, we like science, we need science, but we want you to do the science that answers our questions. And that, I think, is the key, is whose questions are the sciences answering? And I think working towards a people's science is crucial. Why is that? And that is because your I've got a hooter going off outside here, but that's not mine. The work of deciding which questions to answer often comes from the donors or the assessors for various donor applications. And they're very often asking questions in the framework, the ontology, the cosmology, the mythology of a science from the global north that still wants to put nature separate from society and objects separate from subjects. And your example, Mano, of working with local communities is a classic point. With this idea that people must be kept separate from nature, you have the separation of people with a fence, typically, or a law or a policy, from environment and conservation areas, which ignores the processes of living. The people have lived in those places forever. It ignores the history of relations with animals, and imposes very often this very violent, militarized separation between nature and society. And then there's this assumption that nature and people will be mediated by finance. And that's becomes the neoliberal mythology, that finance and economy, financialized economy, mediates nature and society. And so then you could get sustainable tourism coming in, quote, 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 which is going to bring finance in, and that's going to solve it. Well, no, if you're going to financialize relations, then obviously you're going to suit the elites. And so then you get, international tourists coming in, but local people's experience of the nature park is this violent militarism. That's not politically sustainable. And if it's not politically sustainable, it's not environmentally sustainable. So there's this incorrect paradigm that we have to really work to take apart, so we don't keep putting one word in front of the other in the same way as those word clouds. That it was almost like people are speaking in autocomplete on their phones. Your next phone tells you what it thinks your next word is going to be, and people are just kind of going with that, or maybe a chat GPT kind of a thing. But poetics is going to take us out of chat GPT. Poetics asks us to experience the world and to think responsively with the world. How does this affect me? How does it affect those around me? And how can I engage with that? One of the things, and I think I'm going to wrap up with this comment, one of the things that I found really regrettable, and there was a lot to learn from the ways fisheries were managed in the post-apartheid era. Fisheries were managed by categorizing people into, commercial, artisanal, and recreational fishers, which of course those categories with our history, of course they overlaid the race categories one way or another. And that coincidence wasn't theorized. So it was just rolled out as, well, that we had to have no other option, but there wasn't the history being engaged with. And then what that fisheries policy did was it required fishers to report the biomass of the fish that they're catching. So instead of fishers being encouraged to continue to think with the traditional roots of profound respect for the ocean and the kinds of techniques of care that were in different bays. I mean, Greg Duggan, for example, did some work on thinking like a fish, which was a phrase that fishers in Stillby were using. You know, that people were thinking how a fish thinks, thinking about how, what kind of bay does a fish want? And if we want the fish to stay here, we mustn't be destroying the reefs, and so on. And so designing an anchor that would not destroy the reef. So it was this real framework of care. But then that gets erased and discredited as traditional knowledge or kind of superstition or old-fashioned or whatever. And it gets replaced with a cosmology of finance. So, you know, then fishers have to start reporting biomass, and they get allocated quotas in terms of biomass. So you can take so many kilograms of crayfish out, and that is calculated in terms of the typical rate, you know, rand rate that you're going to get for every kilo, and sort of it's calculated in terms of livelihoods and so on. That erases the entire paradigm of care, turns the ocean into an ATM that you must go and catch your fish, catch your money from. And it's you know, there's no framework of care for the ocean. So in the name of conservation, we destroy the indigenous frameworks and require people to take on the paradigm of categorization, counting, and cartography. You know, well, maps and edges and counting and categorizing. Well, we require them to take this objectification kind of way, and then we wonder why people are now treating fish like a commodity and sale, and there's no care for the fish. Well, the sciences foolishly erased that paradigm because there was no respect for traditional knowledge.
Prof Green,
Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I again interrupt you, and I don't want to. I would love to listen more, but we've run out of time. And I just think this powerful message of the ethics of care, you know, and caring, and is so central to, for instance, if you work in a transdisciplinary manner, it's really crucial and central to that way of working. But I want to thank you, and I want to thank Prof Manu for your presentations, and I would still love to see the rest of your presentation that we had to rudely stop to just keep the dialogue alive. So I would really like to maybe arrange another opportunity, with your permission, to take this conversation further. I think it's very, very important for us. And then there's been some questions, you know, on the side that I will take up with the people who asked the questions. Some of them were quite provocative as well, you know, about the kind of mindset we need to develop, etc. And then maybe we can in future talk about the issue of metaphors, you know, what about the future? Because if I just refer quickly to Anat Singh's mushroom at the end of the world, if you talk about Amatev Ghosh's the nutmeg's case, you know, all of those, it's novel format kind of narratives, predicting what we've done, but also predicting where we're going to. And it speaks also to, of course, your book on rock, water, and life. So it's so rich with themes, the conversation itself, and I really hope we get an opportunity to take this up again and further, even not if it's at Future Africa, because I think our program is probably coming to an end there. But thank you very, very much for your presentation. And Prof Manu, thank you so much for participating. And I hope that we can continue this again at some stage.
Sure.
Prof, you want to say?
No, I just want to say thank you. Yeah, it would be wonderful to continue these conversations. And it's really great to have a transdisciplinary audience to engage with. So thank you very, 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 very much. Yeah, and thank you, Mano. I hope that we can continue.
Thank you.
And everybody who participated, just a quick message that the presentation is being recorded, so we will make it available on the Future Africa website as soon as possible.
super. To be continued. Thank you.
Let's go on till we get cut off, I think. Because we are over time, but it doesn't matter. Let's take a chance. I like doing that.
Well, where do you want to start? You know, my occupational hazard is talking too much.
Yeah, I have to go, unfortunately, to another commitment.
Thank you, Mano.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
So, Hester, I want to just there's one slide that I'd like to share. You know, this thing that I want to just really emphasize is that, you know, we are struggling for these insights in the sciences and in this very fraught at times dialogue between the social sciences and the natural sciences. We struggle to find our conversation. And yet it's already there in the work of African decolonial scholars who were grappling with the imposition of modernist thought with its crazy frameworks and its cosmologies, which were presented as pure science and empirical truth. There's nothing empirical about this idea that humans are separate from planet. There's not a single molecule in any of our bodies that doesn't come from the planet. And that's, you know, flowing in and out all the time, even as we're breathing. And one of the thinkers who I find very inspiring is Amilcar Cabral. Not many of you would know that Cabral, before he became, before he was working as a revolutionary, he was a soil scientist. So he began his career as a soil scientist because he'd grown up in a time of famine in Cape Verde on the islands between Portugal and Africa off the west coast. And from his work, it was done really between 1949 and 1953 in soil science. And then he leaves Lisbon, where he trained, to go back to what's now Guinea-Bissau, and works as an agronomist, community by community, teaching people soil care. And he does this kind of big picture, integrative science that undoes these categories, you know, that frees up thinking. You know, this was a science, and this was an African science, and it didn't split humanity from earth. It didn't split people from nature. To defend the earth is to defend the human, is one of his phrases. And he writes, he was an absolutely innovative soil scientist. He wrote soil as a natural, independent, historical and dynamic body. So he's not just categorizing soils and saying, well, in this kind of soil you do this, in this kind of soil. He's saying human action is constantly transforming the soil, as does nature. And nature is perpetually moving and transforming. So this process orientation to knowledge, he's already doing. So I'm delighted to say that Anselmo Matuse and Carlos Lopez and myself will be publishing the first English translation of Cabral's Agronomy later this year, published by one of the HSRC Press imprints. You know, and it's been a joy to discover this work. And so if I leave people with just one thought, is that the work of doing you know, of doing the work of anti-racism, the work of decoloniality, is at the core of figuring out how science can go on from here. So much of the work that was needed was being done in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s by African thinkers. And I'm focusing particularly here, but also in Latin America and in South Asia and so on. There was a lot of really innovative kind of thinking, pushing back against the imposition of modernity's cosmologies. And in this great sweep of history from the 1980s, 1990s, you know, we've kind of accepted the end of imagination. We've accepted that economy links, you know, nature and society. But that in itself was a kind of a peace treaty with the scientists doing diplomacy, going to the leaders of countries and companies to say, okay, we're going to try and speak your language. We'll speak the language of finance because we're desperate now, and we know that at least you'll understand finance. The backlash of that is that now everything is financialized. And so the city of Cape Town, for example, can use a lake as a sink for sewage and say, well, you know, it's ecosystem services. There you go, done and dusted. No. Nature is not dollar values. And that's kind of where we've landed. And so this has been an end of imagination in environmental sciences and sustainability sciences. If you look at the energy map of Africa, which one of my colleagues, Nobukosi Ngwenya, brought to my attention this week, the vast majority of Africa is based on energy from biomass, not coal and oil. Now, you know, but in other words, what that tells us is a very huge proportion of Africa, obviously, is living from the land. You know, there's a lot of loss. There's a loss of knowledge, of traditional knowledge of how the earth works. But it's not too late to start to work to reclaim that. And I think that reclaiming of African environmentalism is central to what we need to be doing. But in order to do that, we need to give ourselves the freedom to not have our words marching across the page from one predictable word to the next predictable word. You know, we need to give ourselves the freedom to reclaim that sense of wonder, that sense of magic, the sense of humor. I mean, you know, one of my breakthrough moments was realizing that insects walk on water. You know, this is astonishing. Some insects can walk on water. You know, wow, this is astonishing. And to allow ourselves to work with that in the same way that the notes of music can make shapes. I mean, science is the art of the unexpected. And somehow in our desperation to make a case that sustainability science must be done in certain ways to get change, we've conceded the paradigm. African thought gives us the leadership that we need to change that paradigm. Thank you. So back to you, Hester.
It's a struggle. There you are. That was again very powerful, and I just cannot agree more with what you've said. And I feel so much in empathy with everything that you've mentioned so far. And it just made me think of so many other African philosophers who are like-minded that we don't even have time to mention, and were way ahead of their time in thinking. So it's really a feeling of catching up again with those wonderful thinkers of the African past, and try and just understand what's going on and combine and put them in for conversation with our modern day philosophers. Like I know you're talking about Bruno Latour. My one favorite is Slavoj Zizek, who keeps on reminding us that we're also a species on this earth and we're destructing our own specieshood, one can call it. So it's such a rich topic, so much to say. I really hope we can carry this on. I will find ways and means for us to keep in conversation on this, because this is, for me, the most important conversation that I had in a very long time. And I thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
I think we'll have to go now because
I have a meeting to get to time. Thank you, everybody. And yeah, this conversation is vital, not just in South Africa, but across the continent, to reclaim African environmentalism. So let's do it.
Thank you very, very much. And I'll keep in touch with you.
Yes, all righty. Thanks.
Right,
Bye-bye.
and thank you everybody else who attended, who are still sitting around listening. Have a good day, and I hope we can talk more about this. I know we will speak by email quite a lot after this conversation. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Lesley. Have a wonderful day.
Cheers. Bye-bye.